Hi, want to welcome everyone to the Bulletin podcast, where we go in depth into the visa bulletin. And with me, of course, is always Charlie Oppenheim, who is our Chatting with Charlie guest and lead individual. So, Charlie, let's take it away and talk about the National Visa Center report that just came out.
Sure. It's great that the State Department finally released this report. It's usually done in about December. This report this first bar graph shows there have been massive increases in the amount of demand that is on file as of November 1st, 2023 versus the year earlier. It's almost a 100,000 increase across the board. And the second chart shows the breakdown among the top countries.
And the top country being China?
China, yes.
Okay, and then following it is India?
India, the Philippines, etc. So again, very large increases across the board. For example, the China employment first preference, almost 5,000 increase. The India increase, not quite as much. But India in the second preference had about a 5,000 increase. So again, very high increases across the board for most countries.
And this means these are the people waiting in the queue to be scheduled or their dates to become current, right?
Correct. Once the USCIS approves a petition and it's indicated that the person will be processing overseas, their petition is sent to the National Visa Center for further processing. And this report lists the total amount of applicants with petitions on file in each of the categories.
So this is regardless of whether they're consular processing or filing adjustment of status?
No, this is strictly consular processing.
So there could be more in the queue, right?
Yes. So the fact that there's 100,000 increase, this is strictly for State Department processing. It does not account for the amount of demand that is being processed stateside. And USCIS typically processes about 85% of all employment cases. So this chart indicates basically it almost guarantees that there will continue to be rest of world employment second and third preference final action dates well into, if not throughout, fiscal 2025.
Okay. So if we go to the next slide, this is broken down by the preference categories. So again, the top country for first preference is China and then India. And then for the second preference, it's India and then China. So any comments on that, Charlie?
Now, again, it's just this indicates that basically because there are rest of world final action dates, that means there will be no otherwise unused numbers that can fall to potential use in India and China, employment second and third preference categories, meaning they will be subject to their per country limits, further indicating that there will be slow forward movement of both the China and India second and third preference final action dates for the foreseeable future.
But employment first preference has no cutoff, right? It's current for the rest of the world.
Right. It's current for rest of world, meaning if there's any unused numbers, those numbers fall across and are used in strictly in priority date order, meaning the numbers would go to India first preference, allowing the India employment first preference final action date to progress at a little bit faster pace than it would normally for India.
So do you think there will be any otherwise unused numbers for employment first?
There will be, as long as rest of world remains current. That means that there are potential unused numbers that can fall across for India number use.
Okay. And then if we go to the next slide, this is our employment third preference. So Philippines being the top usage of employment-based visas, which we think is for the Schedule A nurses, right, Charlie?
Yes. And this has been a tremendous increase over the fiscal or the total that was listed in the November 1st of 2022 report. It's almost a 17,000 increase. Uh, Previously in our podcast, we had mentioned that it is likely that the Philippine third preference final action date will fall behind the rest of world date, probably not until fiscal 2025. But I think that this increase pretty much guarantees that the Philippine third preference date will start to fall slightly behind the rest of world date.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's in Philippines, India, and then there's Kenya, and then there's China. So I didn't even really know about Kenya's usage.
Yeah, it is interesting for people to go through this report. It lists in each of the categories the top countries. So it is sometimes you find it is striking which the countries you will see pop up in the various categories.
Yeah. And then, of course, we have other workers as well. And those are the unskilled workers. So, of course, Mexico and Philippines are there as the top two. And then we have Vietnam and then China as the fourth. So we can go to the next slide. And so this is about the actual main visa bulletin and our employment dates for filing. And this is what we also call the Chart B. So, Charlie, any comments on Chart B?
No, there have not been any changes in the Chart B dates for filing. Immigration is not using these. Immigration Service is only allowing the Chart A dates to be used for filing for adjustment of status. I would not expect any changes in these dates before late summer. If then, the reason possibly these dates may change in late summer is if they want to start generating demand for the next fiscal year. Otherwise, any major changes would not occur until the October visa bulletin.
Okay. And then if we go to the next slide, it's the all chargeability or rest of world. And we see the movement, right? So since December, we're seeing a bit of movement in the EB2 category and the EB3. EB1, of course, has continued to become current. And we see like a couple weeks movement from January to February, and then another couple weeks, February to March, and then a bit of a jump in April 2024, because it goes from November to January. And then also a bit of a jump for the EB3 because it goes from September to November. But then it holds steady in May. So any comments on that, Charlie?
Back in December when we did our podcast, I mentioned that I felt that the State Department may have made a decision to start making their major changes in the final action dates at the beginning of each quarter, meaning the next one would have been in January and then the April dates. And I think that's exactly what we've seen for April. There were major changes, and now they're holding for May, and they may be holding the dates for the next several months.
Okay. And then if we go to the next slide and we break it out to China, right? So in February to March, there was movement, couple weeks, and then movement from March to April by a couple months, and then holding steady in May for EB1. And then for EB2, movement by a month in last month in April to February 1, 2020. Then, of course, EB3 is staying steady since January. So any comments on that, Charlie?
Again, the major movement for April, then I would expect the China first and second to be holding for the next several months. China employment third preference, the State Department uses a sizable amount of these numbers, which it may be the reason for the holding of the China third preference date if Guangzhou is starting to address their backlog which had occurred in earlier years. They may be using higher amounts of China third preference numbers, limiting any forward movement in that date.
Okay. And then if we go to the next slide and we address India, and we see for EB1, February, it moved up in March to October, so by a month, and then moved up significantly in April by about 5 months to March 2021, and then stayed steady in May. And then for EB2, no movement until April and moved up by a month and a half. And so now we're holding, say, April 15, 2012. And then EB3 moved up by a month, and now we're at August 15, 2012. Any comments on that, Charlie?
Again, I think there was the large movement in the first preference. We had predicted that earlier in the year that the date would be moving at a more rapid pace. It finally caught up with our projections. And I think that because of the movement in April, I think that we can see limited movement going forward for the first, second, and third preference India dates. Potentially not moving until much later in the summer.
Okay. And then, of course, your predictions, which we have on our next slide, talks about where you think for the rest of the fiscal year there will be movement. So why don't you summarize what your predictions will be?
Yeah, I think that these dates, although these are the kind of the best case scenarios, again, I think that there was the major movement in April. I think that the State Department will wait and see what the effect in terms of number use is on that April movement of the dates. And they know that there's enough demand in the pipeline that they can pretty much hold the dates until later in the summer if they wish, and then be able to advance the dates in the summer months and still maximize number use under the annual limits. So I think in China, up to 3 weeks in each of the first, second, and third preference category. In India, up to 1 week in each of the categories. And when I say up to, it could be 0 to the amount. And again, these are the projections on average through the end of the fiscal year. So for India, they may only move a total of 1 month between now and September.
Okay. And then if we go to the next slide, we get a lot of questions about the family-based as well. And so family-based dates for filing, you want to just give us your comments on those?
Yeah, the only dates for the dates for filing, there was a change in the rest of world third preference date. It advanced about 6 months. This again, we may start to see some changes in the rest of world filing dates and all of these dates, because the State Department would use these dates to start generating applicants to provide certain required documentation and get them ready for numbers in the next fiscal year. So we may see some changes in these going forward.
Okay. And then if we looked at the final action dates for May, what we're seeing is for family base, it's staying the same, right? But then we're seeing movement. Well, Philippines also stayed the same in the first preference and the F2B, but then we're seeing movement happening in all the other categories. So any comment on that?
Yeah, I think in these categories primarily, and then my comment are primarily in the rest of world, but I think that these dates, the fact that they've all been advancing, we're seeing lots of orange, which is a very positive sign. It indicates that the State Department has pretty much caught up with any of the backlog which had developed during the COVID times, and that I believe that we will see steady, maybe even very rapid forward movement of most of the family-sponsored dates between now and September.
But F2A is still backlog, right? So are we going to see any movement there at any point?
F2A, no, I think that F2A will continue to advance it. It made a very large advancement, as you see, uh, for the month of April or May. So I think we will see that moving. I do not expect that to go back to current, which it was at one time.
Yeah.
But again, I do think that the recovery is of uh, processing is occurring in the F2A category, allowing that date, as with most of the other rest of world dates, to start advancing at a faster pace.
So do you think we'll have any otherwise unused numbers that will go to employment base?
No, there will not. There will not be any otherwise unused numbers that could fall to employment. The State Department, with the use of the final action dates, should maximize number use under the family category limit, which is 226,000. The fact that they will maximize number use will mean there are very few unused numbers, which will be potentially added to the fiscal 2025 employment annual limit, meaning that in 2025 employment annual limit is likely to be significantly less than it was this current year.
Okay. Well, we can talk about that at the next bulletin about what your predictions may be for this coming fiscal year and the annual limits. But with that, I want to thank you, Charlie, for joining us in the bulletin. And of course, please feel free to subscribe to us on our LinkedIn site. And then you can watch all of our videos as well on YouTube. And then also listen to our podcast on Spotify. So thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.